What's going on, everybody? Aslan Hajavandi. That's not a big deal. The big deal is the guys that I'm joined by in the news we're about to discuss, joined by Irish O'Fell, managing editor of Warchant.com, the ultimate Seminoles sports source, as well as founder and administrator of Warchant.com, Gene Williams. Hit the thumbs up, everybody. Feel like we got some really good news, but we're going to get the crux of it from the guys that know the most. Ira, I want to start off with you. This obviously was reported first here by ESPN on Monday morning, but some perhaps finality coming to this lawsuit that's been dragging out between Florida State, Clemson, and the ACC. Apparently, a settlement has been sort of agreed upon here in principle. It'll be voted on tomorrow. And there's kind of two cruxes to this in terms of a restructured distribution of money, and then obviously an earlier, more palatable exit for Florida State and the Clemson programs that have been at the forefront of this. What are your thoughts as we pop it up here on the screen, the settlement and what has kind of been laid out by ESPN so far?
Yeah, so, Florida State obviously filed their lawsuit almost 2 years ago. About 15 months ago. But over the last 4 or 5 months, there seems to have been real settlement talks. I think it was first reported, by Yahoo in September, that there were some negotiations taking place where maybe there could be some common ground found between the FSU, the ACC, and Clemson. And those numbers, I think, were very far apart. As you remember in FSU's lawsuit, they were talking about they might be required to pay $570, $600 million to get out of the conference. That number, as I was hearing in recent weeks, was being whittled down. And now ESPN, the number they put out there now is if Florida State does want to leave the conference, it could drop down to around $100 million or less by 2030, which is a huge difference from what it was, and getting out way before 2036. And then in the short term, the schools that have the bigger brands, which is something Florida State was arguing for before they filed their lawsuit, they're now going to be getting upwards of $15 to $20 million a year out of that TV pie, not necessarily more than those other schools, but they're going to be getting an additional $15 to $20 million more a year, while the other schools in the conference are going to be getting much less. And I think some of them are going to be taking less than they've been taking so far. So from that standpoint, yeah, I mean, the exit fee and departure date may have shrunk, and then you also are going to be getting more money per year in the short term. And, we'll all debate over the next, probably year, 2 or 3 years, how big of a win it was for Florida State and whether or not the ACC got what they wanted. But I think, from a standpoint of what FSU was asking for at the beginning, they're getting a lot of it here in this new deal.
Yeah, so it sounds like Florida State wants more money. They're probably going to get that. They want to pay less to get out of this conference, so they want to get out of it earlier than 2036. So it sounds like most of that is lined up. Let us know what you folks think in the comments about whether or not that's a win for Florida State or not. This guy's opinion might change your about it, and that would be Gene Williams. Gene, looking at this, you've been at the forefront of this since, 2012 seemingly. When you see these numbers, you see not only the numbers in terms of dollars, but the year. And 2036 no longer being that sort of albatross around your neck. What do you think about this? Is this a stalemate for all schools and parties involved, or is this a win for Florida State, Clemson, and those that want to exit at some point?
Yeah, that's something I think is going to be debated among the fans here over the next, probably several years, the way this thing's going out. So the accountant and the attorney in me says win. You start running these numbers that Ira laid out for us, and you're talking, if they leave in the next couple of years, what do we run off? $500 million, probably the way everything adds up. And you're talking now the fee down to 20, reduced to $100 million. And I think a couple of things you got to keep in mind with this new revenue distribution model. You're talking over the next 5-6 years, whatever that's going to be, $100 million plus more in Florida State's coffers that they weren't going to get before. And a lot of fans don't want to consider. And we had a poll up recently a couple of weeks ago, and I was kind of a little surprised. And I laid out a scenario that, look, I just kind of guessed, but it's not that dissimilar than what it looks like this proposed settlement is going to be. And what would you be okay with that? I'd say it was almost 90% people were not for it. They were very upset at this, and I get it. Florida State has been absolutely raked over the coals by ACC, ESPN the last few years, so there's an emotional component to this thing that they didn't want to settle. They wanted to get out, but man, you're talking hundreds of millions of dollars. And if you were to leave early, and let's say the SEC and the Big 10 were to even take you, you're probably not getting a full share. But the way they've lined these things up with the way the TV contracts are in these conferences and the way the new college playoff is going to be structured around that same time, there is going to be new contracts. It's a perfect time to come in and join and probably get a full share. So you're talking another $100 million, $200 million there. You start adding up these numbers, And it's hard not to say objectively this was a win for FSU. I get it. You don't want to be stuck in the conference for the next several years. You're getting bad officiating calls. ESPN puts you on ESPN Ocho while SEC gets all the primetime spots. I get it. It's frustrating as heck. But I do think this is realistic. And I got to say one thing to the fans, this was never going to court. And I read all these. I read the stuff on social media. I read the long realignment thread. And there's so many people convinced that Florida State was going to go to court and have this glorious victory and not have to spend any money. That's just not how these things work. You could have been years and years and years down the road, and there's still a chance you might not have won. So I do think on the whole, objectively look at this, this is a pretty substantial win for Florida State and Clemson.
Everybody wanted the Discovery face to kick in, Gene, right? They thought that was going to.
Let's hit the whole Swapper family, man. Let's get them. Let's get them in depositions.
Ira, what do you think has changed? I mean, you've been seeing sort of the trend lines through all this, but this is something that Florida State has brought up time and time again about, not necessarily wanting to, blow this entire conference up, but just kind of pay us our fair share, quote unquote. And, the ACC pushed back time and time again, but then ultimately this is also going to include the Success Initiative that's already been in play for a few years now. What do you think this kind of means for at least Florida State's stance that they should be paid kind of fair rates for what they've brought to this conference all this time?
I think it's fascinating if you think back to, again, that before FSU filed the lawsuit, that spring meetings when FSU first started kind of talking, Michael Alford started making some comments, Peter Collins had made some comments, including here on Warchant TV, and the Board of Trustees chair. And, that they were basically saying, listen, we deserve more than these other schools. We've made the ACC what it is. It may not be what you want it to be, but whatever it is largely made based on Florida State and Clemson over the last, 20, 30 years. They're the only ones that have had sustained football success, and that's what drives the ship. But every time they talked in meetings, every time they went to the ACC spring meetings in 2023, they went over to Amelia Island. They had their spring meetings, and it was like a brawl. And the other ACC schools, the two things FSU wanted were expanded payouts for schools that have success. If you win on the field, you should get paid more. And the schools that bring in the biggest television ratings should get paid more. And there was just no interest at all in the television side. They just wouldn't even discuss that. And then, they ended up giving a little bit on the Success Initiative, where if you have success on the field, you get more money, but they would never budge on the other. So Florida State had to file the lawsuit. And it's kind of unfortunate that FSU became persona non grata nationally in college football because they had the audacity to sue their conference and they had the audacity to challenge a grant of rights. And how dare they talk about their other schools the way they have, like they're better than. Well, now it took that, though, to get these schools to come to the table. And the way these negotiations happen, it's not like Jim Phillips, who's the chair, the
conference commissioner.
Commissioner. I couldn't remember his title. CEO, the commissioner of the ACC. He doesn't get to just say what they're going to do. It's not like a commissioner in Major League Baseball with the owners. Well, I guess it is like that. He has to do what the owners say, and this is the same thing with Phillips. He has to do what these schools say. Well, now, because of the lawsuit, and because I'm sure their attorneys are telling them, listen, this lawsuit this grant of rights that you think is ironclad, and this lawsuit that you think you're going to win may not go the way you think it's going to go. So that's what's led to these negotiations. And again, the number ESPN put out there was $15 million or more. I'm hearing it's might be closer to $20 million a year more for Florida State in this deal. And big picture, the reason this became such a hot button issue was the SEC and Big Ten schools were soon going to be getting $30 to $40 million more a year than the ACC schools. Well, now if FSU gets 15 to 20 million more in the brand part of it, and then they do have success on the field and you get more money there, you are shortening this gap to much closer to what it had been the last several years. And so I think that's one thing that's really changed is those schools have realized that this is possible. The other part of it is, like Gene said, though, if Florida State wanted to get out tomorrow, even if they wanted to pay the $500 million tomorrow to get out of the ACC, I think they've come to realize also that because the Big Ten and the SEC are still in the middle of their contracts, they're probably not going to get a full share. I do believe that, I do believe the Big Ten and or the SEC are going to want Florida State, contrary to what you've heard from a lot of national media who tell you that there's no interest in Florida State or Clemson. I firmly believe that Florida State would have a place to go in one of those two conferences. But if you do it now or next year, you're not going to get a full payout for them because they're in the middle of their contract. But if it is closer to 2030, 2031, 2032, as those contracts are coming up, now you pay a much lower fee and you might get a full share from those conferences. So from that standpoint, it just doesn't make sense. As much as emotionally, as Gene said, people want to get out tomorrow. If you were making this decision in your house with your own finances about whether to buy a car or buy a new house, or you would look at the numbers and you would see it makes more sense to go for this kind of deal.
Right. And just to underscore that, Gene, obviously everybody wants to leave, as Ira said, you've mentioned, they want to leave tomorrow. But when you see a number like this on the screen here, where it says top earners are expected to net an additional $15 million or more, according to this new revenue sharing, and, for the next 5 years, that whatever you're not going to be excited about not being in one of these Power 2 conferences, I mean, you're still going to be able to compete and you still leave yourself in a much better fiscal position once this does end to, get the best next contract from whatever conference wants to bring you in.
And I think that's the biggest concern, really, when this whole thing started. With, I think there were two components to this. As Ira pointed out, that revenue gap's going to continue to get wider and wider. And can you remain, to the point, whenever you do get out, can you remain competitive? And at some point, if that gap starts to be in the 30, 40, even 50 million based on some projections, there's no way you can compete with the Floridas, the Alabamas, the Auburns, the Georgias, who are right in your area. So the fear is, by the time you would be out of the ACC, the brand would have been killed so much that you're really in trouble at that point. You're not even marketable. Maybe the Big Ten or the SEC doesn't even want you at that stage. So that's been taken care of a little bit, I think, on this too. And the other fear is, and it's still there a little bit to an extent, is that how damaged will FSU's brand be being in the ACC the next several years? Because you've seen the writings on the wall with, I just mentioned earlier, the coverage. What you're seeing from ESPN, who is your network partner, if they continue to treat you like a second-class citizen, they've got a Power 2, and they're fully invested in one of those Power 1s, the SEC, and they relegate you and don't want to promote you and make sure you don't get in the playoffs when you deserve it. We've already seen that. And we've continued to see now the SEC is one, SEC, Big Ten are wanting each, 4 guaranteed each? And is that going to continue to be degraded where maybe you're not making the playoffs? So there is still that component that you were worried about with the brand. But again, in terms of the money, that's what FSU started this thing out with, because they needed to remain competitive financially. And it seems like that's a clear win, that they will at least be in the ballpark the next several years revenue-wise with their competitors. So we'll see how that brand does the next few years. Obviously, FSU wins at a high level. That will solve a lot of the problems.
And if I could just jump in here real quick, I just want to clarify one thing, because there's been so many numbers thrown out there about what that revenue gap is over the last 2 years. And the perception has been that Florida State can't let that gap be more than over $10 million a year or whatever. It's been over $10 million a year for quite a long time. It was back when this started over a decade ago, when Gene first started reporting about it in the early 2010s. That number was around $3 or $4 million, and it's gone up, and it's been over $10 million. So if they can get it to $20 million gap, which sounds crazy, but man, now you're a lot closer to what it's been. It's already been there. You weren't going to get it to $5 million. You were not going to get the gap that small because it hasn't been there for a long time anyway. So again, these are all positive things. Now there's a trade-off. Florida State's not getting all this for free. I think it's been previously reported Florida State and Clemson now are going to have to play Notre Dame more often. They're going to have to play some more high-profile games to give ESPN, to wet ESPN's beak a little bit more. So it's not a total win for Florida State, but again, if you think about where they were from before the lawsuit, I mean, it's night and day.
Yeah, I think there's 2 other things on the mind as we sit here and talk about, again, the settlement includes all 4 of these ongoing lawsuits to be completely dropped, and then they move forward with this sort of changed distribution. But first off, just what's the ACC thinking they were going to look like in 2031? I guess that's not going to really be Florida State's problem anymore. But I do wonder, this short-term security the ACC has tried to receive by doing this, what they hope to gain from it. And then second off, grant of rights is something that continues to be on the forefront of everybody's mind. I'm going to kind of read some of the stuff off to you guys. And again, Ira, I think tomorrow on Tuesday, the ACC Board of Trustees or Board of Governors, and then FSU's Board of Trustees and Clemson's Board of Trustees will then go ahead and make these votes official. But right now, according to the reporting from ESPN, specific financial figures for schools to get released from the grant of rights were not readily available, but the total cost to exit the league after 2030 is expected to drop below $100 million. And then later in the story, Gene, it says right here, sources told ESPN that there would be just one number to exit the league, not the combination that Florida State and we'd been kind of operating under, where there's going to be this exit fee, but then you also have to pay the grant of rights. So I would imagine we'll probably get some clarification on that in the next like 24 hours or so after these trustees and these boards meet, Ira.
Yeah, and just real quick on that, just hearing whispers from talking to people around Florida State, as recently as, within the last couple of weeks, I was hearing that number was in the closer to 120 or 130 million, which to me, I thought, man, this has really come a long way from 500 to 600 million dollars. So if they got it under $100 million as a one fee, again, man, I really think, because you can make that up now in just a few years. I mean, legitimately, you can make that up, and you would also have a concrete number, because the other part of this was nobody really had ever challenged the grant of rights, so nobody knew what a court would decide. And to Gene's point, if it ever really went to trial, neither side would want to let it go to the trial, and then so nobody knew exactly what the number was going to be. So to get this to an ironclad number, if it's under 100 million, I personally think it's a big win for Florida State, because again, from where you were, and then the other part of it, as you said, with the conference, what they're going to look like in the future, I think they know the writing on the wall. I think there's some schools in this conference now that have finally realized, listen, we can't, the golden handcuffs we had on Florida State and Clemson, North Carolina, and maybe Miami that we thought we had, or maybe not as ironclad as we thought. And so at this point, I think their idea is just get as much money as they can before either one of two things happens. My guess is the league the ACC will pick up other schools, or join like bring some of the Big East schools in, something like that, or maybe merge with another defunct conference, and piece something together and be a league of schools that are not competing at that highest level. Because it's clear, I mean, the Big Ten and the SEC are playing a different sport than everybody else. And what this whole thing is about is FSU, Clemson, and we found out recently North Carolina has said they're going to go too. They just wanted FSU and Clemson to pay all the legal fees. Those schools are going to be bailing.
We'll send them a bill.
Yeah, exactly. They should. Maybe they'll pick up dinner one night in Greensboro. But I think that's the ACC's future will be either it'll break off completely. My guess is they'll pick up some schools and become a basketball smaller sport conference.
And again, we don't have the terms in front of us, but we talked about this off camera. But who's even say that this $100 million that it's going to even drop below at 2030 is going to have to be like a lump sum? So there might be Florida State's ability to pay this off over the course of years and be very solvent moving forward. I guess just to kind of put a bow on it from the both of you before we go, Gene, just this ultimately, you can't make everybody happy. I mean, it is a settlement after all. It's not absolute victory, but this feels about as close to absolute victory as you possibly could get, because as we mentioned, the fact of the matter that, listen, you're going to get more money in the next 5 years, and then 5 years from now, you'll still be able to be competing against all these power conferences to get in the playoff, win in the playoff, and then you can leave fairly pain-free versus what we thought, 18 months ago, 2 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, it's, when I thought about this, when I write out some scenarios on our message boards talking about this stuff, this was definitely the best case scenario. I thought that was realistic for Florida State. I know everybody wants a smoking gun that you could have been out in 2026, but I never thought that was realistic, that was going to happen. So, man, again, it's hard objectively to look at this and not go, man, this is a big win for FSU. And I mean, to get that revenue split that we're talking, that's going to be up to 15 to 20 million. I don't know, Ira, if you thought, I thought it was going to be well under 10 probably when this thing worked out.
When I was talking, somebody told me it was going to be around 18 million. I was like, I could not believe it. I thought it was going to be closer to 5 to 10. Yeah.
And for the penalty to reduce to 100 or less at the end, and like you point out, as a good point, these things usually aren't a lump sum. You can pay it off over the next 5 years, considering what the money you're going to be getting potentially from the Big Ten or SEC. I mean, that's going to be nothing to give a few $1 million each year off of that. Now, I'm going to be curious, so we'll see the terms, and we'll spend on Warchant a long time breaking it down when this is official. We get to look at it and writing all the details. I wonder, because a lot of times right now, Florida State has a ironclad contract with the ACC. They can't go out there and negotiate with the Big Ten, at least openly, or the SEC. Is there a provision where are they allowed to now open negotiations with them, or they still have to be kind of behind the scenes? What's going to happen? But I think you might start to see some more momentum after this is done, in terms of, what is realistic? If the Big Ten, and I do firmly believe they have at least a handshake offer from the Big Ten, at what point does that move forward? And then at what point does that pressure the SEC to say, okay, this has become real now. We're about to lose. We're about to get someone to come right in our market, 2 big-time schools in Miami, maybe 2.5 big-time schools that are going to come in our market, and Fox is going to have a stronghold here. They're going to have a foothold. Do we want to let this happen? Does Stanky and ESPN go, we're not going to let that happen? So that's going to be fascinating to see how that plays out the next few years.
Yeah,
No,
just
perfectly said. I mean, because people might think 5 years of being in limbo, but to your point, Gene, it sounds like now it's open season. You've got the green light now if you're Tony Petitti or Greg Sankey to talk to Florida State. Right.
Yeah, and even if it's not officially written anywhere that's going to be the case, I mean, I think, listen, man, Florida State's going to be operating that way. And I would think, I think my recollection is the Big Ten contract comes up first in 2031.
Yep.
And then the SEC contract comes up a couple years later. If the Big Ten, I mean, it's going to be hard for them if they really want to compete with the SEC and not just be the second fiddle to the SEC. This Florida State could not be any more attractive to them than they are right now. And so when the SEC realizes that, and we've heard all the people say the SEC has no interest, they're already in the state of Florida, they're already in the state of South Carolina, they don't need Clemson. I get all that. But if they, as Gene said, if they really believe that this is a true threat to get those schools down here, recruiting down here, operating down here in this conference down here, they could have Big Ten meetings in Miami if they wanted to.
Yeah, in the only national conference.
Yeah, exactly. That'll be their differentiator. At that point, now does the SEC come back and say, no, we can't let this happen. So while the Big Ten goes in 2031 and the SEC's later, is it possible the SEC acts early to preempt the Big Ten and says, you know what, we got to do this before then, and we'll help you pay it or whatever to make it happen. So, yeah, I mean, I think right now things are going to settle. And the last thing I tell FSU fans is for your friends that only read headlines and they only see the headline that says FSU, Clemson, ACC, let's settle lawsuits, and they try to give you grief about it. I do not believe Florida State's going to be in the ACC more than just a few more years, whether it's 2030, 2031, and then they're going to be in one of those big 2 conferences. I'm never more confident of that now. I'm more confident of that now than I ever had before. And so, it's not when you wanted, but you might get what you wanted.
Yeah, to that point, like you were a toxic punchline. Now you're the belle of the ball. Like you're well positioned now to take that next step. Last thing for me, if you want to make a comment on it, Gene or Ira, but just I guess like Peter Collins.
Yeah.
I mean, for a guy that's not involved in college athletics and to come from a college athletics background, administrative background, I'm sure there might have been some sleepless nights for him. Ira just kind of wondering what he's put his alma mater through and if they'd be able to get the other side of this clean and clear. But, for as much sort of ribbing they take on the message boards, Florida State's administration, they've played this pretty deftly. So I'm not the one to give out much plaudits when it comes to administrators, but because I don't know that much, but listening to you guys and seeing all the numbers on the screen, Florida State seems to be in really good hands from whether it's Westcott or all the way up to Moore to the Board of Trustees right now.
Gene, do you think public opinion will ever sway? Because as we said, right now, the initial reactions are mostly negative. Do you think that'll sway at all?
I do think it will. I think once it settles in and they start, there's going to be a lot of reports about the numbers when they start seeing those hundreds of millions of dollars over and over again. If not, we're going to beat it on them. We're going to show them that over and over again. Like, look, at the end of the day, man, you've won on the stuff you needed to win on. And I get we're all impatient. I think emotions will settle down, and I think they'll feel that way. And to follow up what you said, Aslan, it's amazing when you have competent business people involved in making these high-level decisions. Just to compare that to years ago, I hate to keep throwing them under the bus, but having Alex Barron and
Eric Barron.
Eric Barron. Yeah.
Alex Barron.
No, he might have done better. The other Barron, the offensive lineman of Florida State, him and Wilcox running this show obviously was a disaster. Now you see what people like Peter Collins, and Mike Alford, who's obviously been involved in a lot of these big time negotiations too, having these kind of guys running the show, what a difference it makes. So yeah, like you said, hats off to what they've been able to negotiate here.
And real quick on that, also just a credit to the whole administration because they're all unified. You mentioned Michael Alford and Peter Collins, but also Richard McCullough, the president of the university, and then the board of trustees. This was a very unified front on a tough issue because a lot of schools would not have wanted to do this. Clemson was ready to sue when Florida State was. It took them another couple months to actually do it. And then even when they did it, they never really kind of went all, full barrels blasting the way Florida State did. So yeah, I think they definitely deserve a lot of credit. And, the other thing I would say is, they weren't dealing with all the cards. We've talked about the ACC. Jim Phillips has had a bad hand. He's been dealt with this conference. What could he do? It's a bad hand. Well, to some degree, because those decisions you mentioned, Gene, Florida State's been operating from the bad hand. They signed a contract. I mean, the president of the university signed a contract till 2036. So it wasn't like Florida State could just go and demand, no, we want out tomorrow. They made some mistakes in this too, and they've got some skin in the game. And but I think all things considered, I think we all agree it's a win.
Coverage of this is obviously going to be continuing over at warchant.com. Ira, Mondays, you usually hang out with Jeff Cameron and Tom Lang. Can we expect you to maybe break this down a little bit further with any more information that comes your way in the next hour or so?
I think Tom already sent me the link. Jumping in with them.
All right, awesome. And then everything else you'll need to know over at warchant.com. Let us know again what you think about Florida State's updated settlement here with them along with Clemson and trying to create some better terms, I guess, if you will. Again, all 4 lawsuits will be dropped. This will be voted on tomorrow, Tuesday, by both Florida State and Clemson's Board of Trustees, as well as the ACC Board of Governors. New distribution model, reduced exit. Let us know what you think in the comments below. Stay connected to warchant.com, the ultimate Seminoles sports source, and hit the thumbs up because you had Ira Schofel and Gene Williams giving you all the information for free, everybody, for free. Thanks for doing this, guys. Appreciate you.